By 1:30, the lunch at Tolland House had already exceeded its proper ambitions. It was meant to be a small affair, 4 guests, a single joint, and the understanding that everyone would leave by 3 with a pleasant sense of having done the correct thing. Instead, the oysters arrived. They were not on the menu. No one had discussed them. Mrs. Cavendish, who had planned the lunch with the tidy determination she applied to church flowers and condolence letters, had not ordered them. Yet there they were, 6 of them, sweating gently on crushed ice, borne into the dining room by her niece Harriet, with an expression that suggested both apology and defiance. Inspector Purbright, seated nearest the window, observed this development with interest but no alarm. But he had accepted the invitation because it was polite to do so, and because he had learned, over years of village life, that lunches revealed more than evenings ever did. People behaved better at night. At lunch, they grew careless, particularly if surprised. "I thought," Harriet said, setting the platter down with unnecessary firmness, "that we might as well." Mrs. Cavendish stared at the oysters as if they were a philosophical problem. "Might as well what?" "Enjoy ourselves," Harriet replied. "For once." The word once settled into the room and refused to move. Mr. Linton, the solicitor, adjusted his napkin. Miss Felgrove, who taught music at the primary school and disliked seafood on principle, leaned back slightly as though distance alone might protect her. Inspector Purbright smiled into his water glass. It was a small smile, private, and easily mistaken for reflection. He had already noticed that Harriet's hands were shaking, though not from the cold. "They'll go off if we don't," Harriet added too quickly. Mrs. Cavendish recovered first. She always did. "Very well," she said, "though I don't see why surprises are necessary." "They aren't," Harriet said. "Not usually." The oysters remained untouched. Conversation resumed in a cautious fashion, circling the weather, the state of the footpath near the brook, and the regrettable decline of proper handwriting. It was all perfectly normal, which made the silence around the platter increasingly conspicuous. Inspector Purbright was aware, as he listened, of a faint alteration in the room's temperature, not physical precisely, but social, the sort of shift that occurred when something unspoken began to press against its boundaries. "Do you eat them?" Miss Felgrove asked suddenly, nodding at the oysters with the air of someone addressing an unexploded device. "Sometimes," Purbright said, "when they behave themselves." Mr. Linton gave a brief laugh, then stopped, as if reconsidering whether laughter was appropriate. "I had understood," he said carefully, "that oysters were stimulating." Mrs. Cavendish's expression tightened. "We're not discussing that." "No," Harriet said, "we're discussing why they're here." No one answered. Outside, a car passed too slowly. It was Mr. Linton who finally reached for one, perhaps because solicitors disliked leaving things unresolved. He applied lemon, considered it, and then paused. "This is quite unnecessary," he said, though he did not put it down. "That depends," Harriet replied, "on what you think is necessary." Inspector Purbright watched the exchange with mild curiosity. He had been invited, he suspected, not for his profession, but for his reputation for listening without interruption. Villages valued that quality. Mr. Linton ate the oyster. Nothing immediate happened. He looked faintly disappointed. "Well," he said. "There we are." Mrs. Cavendish exhaled. "Can we proceed now?" Harriet did not sit. She remained standing, hands flat on the table, eyes fixed not on the oysters, but on her aunt. "Before we do," she said, "there's something that ought to be acknowledged." Miss Felgrove stiffened. "At lunch?" "Yes," Harriet said, "at lunch." Inspector Purbright folded his napkin with care. "This," he thought, was the moment, or not the beginning of anything dramatic, but the point at which the village's careful arrangements began to loosen. Mrs. Cavendish's voice was cool. "If you have something to say, Harriet, say it properly." "I am," Harriet replied. "This is as proper as it gets." The oysters glistened, patient and obscene in their abundance. Outside, the slow car had stopped. Inspector Purbright waited. He always did. Harriet did not speak at once, which was unusual enough to draw attention without anyone admitting it aloud. She stood as though waiting for permission that had already been withheld, while Mrs. Cavendish arranged her knife and fork with ceremonial patience. Inspector Purbright observed the minute courtesies exchanged like coins passed across a counter, each one small yet carefully weighed. No one wished to appear rude, though everyone felt the strain of politeness stretched beyond comfort. Outside, the stationary car coughed, fell silent, and became another thing nobody mentioned, which suited the table perfectly. It was the sort of moment villages stored carefully, to be unfolded later with interest, exaggeration, and the reassurance of shared memory among familiar faces only. Mrs. Cavendish cleared her throat and thanked Harriet for the oysters, a courtesy that sounded like closure, but was not intended as such. Harriet inclined her head, accepting gratitude without conceding anything further. Mr. Linton commented on the freshness, assuming this would settle the matter, while Miss Felgrove studied her plate as if it might offer instruction. Assumptions gathered quietly. Everyone assumed the oysters were symbolic, though no one agreed of what. Or they assumed Harriet was making a point that Mrs. Cavendish understood it, and that the inspector was already arranging conclusions behind his eyes, which was entirely unfair. Unfair because he was instead listening for the pauses, the careful omissions, and the relief people felt when someone else spoke first, rather than risk the exposure of thought too soon. The arrival of soup should have restored order. It usually did. Bowls were passed, spoons aligned, and conversation resumed with cautious gratitude. Harriet finally sat smoothing her skirt, and for a moment everyone believed the disruption had passed. Yet the inspector noticed how Mr. Linton avoided her eyes, how Mrs. Cavendish's politeness had hardened, becoming a surface rather than a manner. Miss Felgrove asked whether anyone had heard from Mrs. Hale recently, and a question apparently innocent, though it landed with unexpected weight. Harriet answered too quickly, assuring them all was well, which no one had suggested otherwise. The inspector noted the assumption forming that reassurance equaled truth, and that concern, once expressed, demanded an answer shaped for comfort. Such answers were common currency in the village, spent freely to avoid further inquiry at inconvenient moments, and seldom questioned until later. After the plates were cleared, Mrs. Cavendish proposed coffee in the drawing-room, a small migration that allowed everyone to rearrange loyalties in motion. Harriet lingered behind, collecting the oyster shells with deliberate care, as if their emptiness mattered. Inspector Purbright offered to help, which she declined with a smile too even to trust. When they rejoined the others, more of the talk had shifted to local matters, the fate committee, the unreliable plumber, the rumour of change at the post office. Each topic carried the same purpose, to remind everyone of normal patterns. Normality, the inspector reflected, was not the absence of trouble, but the shared agreement to postpone its discussion until a more suitable hour. This agreement often lasted longer than intended and grew heavier with every polite deferral, added to its weight by habit, fear, and mutual convenience combined. Coffee loosened tongues slightly. Mr. Linton spoke of his walk that morning, noting the stillness near the river. Miss Felgrove agreed, remarking how quiet the village had become lately, as though holding its breath. Mrs. Cavendish corrected them, insisting nothing was amiss, that quiet was preferable to fuss. Harriet said nothing, stirring her cup until the spoon rang softly. Inspector Purbright watched the sound ripple through the room, noticing how each person interpreted it differently. Impatience, nerves, thought. Assumptions again, layered and untested. The inspector suspected the village survived on such assumptions, trusting them until circumstance required closer examination, which everyone hoped would be unnecessary today. Hope proved a flexible thing here, stretched across conversations and silences alike, concealing unease without resolving it in any lasting sense whatsoever for the moment. At least, they told themselves quietly and politely, enough. When Mrs. Cavendish excused herself to answer the telephone, the room altered. Mr. Linton relaxed, Miss Felgrove leaned forward, and Harriet's gaze fixed on the window. The call was brief. Our Mrs. Cavendish returned with composed regret, explaining it was a wrong number, though her hand lingered on the doorframe. Inspector Purbright filed the detail away. Wrong numbers were common, but explanations offered before questions were invitations to assumption. He sipped his coffee and asked, mildly, whether the oysters had been delivered from the village. It was an ordinary inquiry, framed as interest, yet it shifted attention outward, where responsibility could be shared rather than privately borne. Mrs. Cavendish answered at once, too quickly, naming a supplier everyone recognized, which satisfied them unevenly, and left Harriet watching the inspector with sudden appraisal rather than relief, as though reconsidering what he heard. The afternoon drew toward its close with expressions of gratitude and promises repeated from habit. Egg coats were fetched, umbrellas discussed, and nothing further was said of oysters, phone calls, or still rivers. Yet as they stood by the door, Miss Felgrove touched Harriet's arm and murmured something too low to hear, while Mr. Linton avoided the inspector entirely. Mrs. Cavendish thanked everyone with perfect warmth. Inspector Purbright stepped outside last, noting the empty road and the car gone at last. The village had resumed its shape, but the assumptions formed at lunch remained, waiting. They would inform glances, colour recollections, and guide choices made with confidence later, when consequences felt both distant and deserved. For now the inspector allowed them to settle, content to let courtesy do its quiet work, before understanding demanded something less comfortable from everyone involved here. Inspector Purbright walked the length of the lane at an unhurried pace, conscious that the village preferred events to travel more slowly than people. By the time he reached the corner by the post-box, the lunch at Tolland House had already begun to divide itself into recollections, each shaped by temperament and convenience. He understood this process well enough to allow it space. Truth, in villages, rarely arrived whole. It came instead as a set of manners, each one offering a version that could be lived with. He paused, letting Mrs. Cavendish's voice echo in his memory, not for its words, but for the precision with which it avoided others. The first version would be hers. In it, the afternoon remained largely successful. There had been a small surprise, yes, but nothing improper. Harriet's oysters were an enthusiasm, perhaps ill-judged, or yet harmless. Mrs. Cavendish would emphasize her own composure, the smooth continuation of lunch, and the agreeable discussion that followed. She would omit the telephone call entirely, or describe it as trivial, depending on her audience. In her telling, nothing truly unsettled occurred, and any suggestion otherwise would be an exaggeration bordering on impoliteness. Inspector Purbright suspected she would believe this version sincerely. Control, after all, was not merely an aspiration for her, but a form of reassurance she extended to herself and others alike. The second version belonged to Mr. Linton. He would recount the same afternoon with greater detail, though less certainty. He would note Harriet's manner, the curious arrival of the oysters, and the sense that something had been implied without explanation. And he would mention the stillness outside, the car lingering on the road, and the wrong number that did not feel entirely wrong. Yet he would frame these as curiosities rather than warnings. Mr. Linton disliked unresolved matters, but disliked embarrassment more. His version would end with the conviction that, had there been anything genuinely concerning, someone more decisive would have said so. The inspector smiled faintly at this thought, aware how often such reliance postponed clarity. The third version inevitably would be Harriet's, though she would share it sparingly. Hers would be a quieter account, stripped of pleasantries and weighted with intention. She would recall every hesitation, every deflection, and the careful way her aunt had thanked her, as though closing a door. Harriet would remember the inspector's question about the oysters more vividly than any other remark because it had not required an answer designed for comfort. She would not describe the afternoon as successful. She might not describe it at all, choosing instead to carry it intact, a private inventory of moments that had failed to align as expected. Inspector Purbright suspected this version would change least over time because it had been formed without the expectation of approval. As he continued along the lane, the inspector considered how these versions would meet. They would do so gradually through conversation offered as concern, curiosity dressed as gossip, and observations framed as coincidence. Miss Felgrove, for instance, would speak of the afternoon as peculiar, though she would insist she meant nothing by it. She would mention Harriet's tension and Mrs. Cavendish's firmness, then wonder aloud whether anyone had heard more about the quiet near the river. Each remark would be received politely, acknowledged, and stored. The village was very good at storage. It knew how to keep things without examining them too closely, trusting that familiarity would eventually explain what investigation might complicate. Inspector Purbright reached the gate to his own cottage and stopped, turning back toward the village centre. He was in no hurry to retreat indoors. The afternoon light lingered, encouraging reflection rather than action. He considered the car that had waited outside Tolland House, already receding into speculation. Some would insist it meant nothing, others would attach it firmly to the oysters or to Harriet's insistence on acknowledgement. A few would combine all three into a narrative both alarming and reassuring in equal measure, because it confirmed the village's preference for significance that stopped short of obligation. The inspector allowed himself a moment of dry amusement at how efficiently people constructed meaning, provided it did not require them to alter behavior too soon. Later that day, Mrs. Cavendish would telephone Mrs. Hale, ostensibly to inquire after her health, but also to establish continuity. Mr. Linton would draft a letter he might never send, outlining a concern he could not quite justify. Harriet would walk alone, retracing the afternoon in her mind, measuring what she had hoped would happen against what had merely occurred. None of these actions would feel decisive to those undertaking them. Each would seem a courtesy, an act of prudence, or simply habit. Yet Inspector Purbright knew that such minor motions accumulated. They shaped the ground upon which clearer events would soon stand, whether welcomed or resisted by those involved. As the church clock struck the hour, the inspector resumed his walk, passing neighbours who nodded with comfortable recognition. No one asked about lunch, no one needed to. The afternoon had already become 3 polite versions, circulating quietly, gathering confidence as repetitions smoothed their edges. In time, one would prove insufficient, another would collapse under the weight of detail, the third would remain largely unspoken, exerting its influence indirectly. For now the village settled into its chosen understandings, satisfied that nothing had truly happened, while something, unremarkable in appearance yet persistent in effect, had begun its patient work among them all. The notice board outside St. Aldhelm's stood in its usual place, slightly askew, its glass smeared with fingerprints that suggested more interest than the content strictly deserved. Inspector Purbright paused before it the following morning, not because he expected revelation, but because it was where the village chose to reassure itself. Notices here explained what was happening, what had already happened, and what would happen again next Thursday, weather permitting. They did not explain what troubled people, which was precisely why he read them carefully. The board announced a jumble sale, choir practice, and a reminder about flowers for Harvest Sunday. There was nothing about oysters, telephones, or stillness by the river. There never was. Yet Purbright was aware that several villagers, passing by with dogs or baskets, slowed their steps just enough to glance at him. It was not curiosity exactly, but calculation. His presence altered the meaning of the familiar. If the inspector stood before the notice board, then something might soon require notice elsewhere, and this possibility unsettled even those who preferred not to articulate it. Mrs. Bellingham approached with her terrier, greeting Purbright with brisk warmth. She remarked on the weather, the jumble sale, and how helpful it was to have things written down plainly. Purbright agreed. He asked whether the notice board was often updated. She replied that it was, though not always promptly, and sometimes important matters waited for the right moment. This struck her as sensible. He thanked her, and she moved on, satisfied she had contributed without revealing anything she might later wish unsaid. Inside the church, Miss Felgrove was arranging hymn books, her movements efficient but restless. She greeted Purbright with a nod, then commented that the notice board was due for repainting. He said it had character. She hesitated, then mentioned the lunch at Tolland House as if recalling an obligation rather than an event. Her description was mild, pleasant enough, a little strained, nothing remarkable. Yet she lingered on Harriet's oysters, wondering aloud whether they had been intended as a joke. Purbright said he had not found them amusing. Miss Felgrove flushed, then laughed softly, agreeing that humour was unpredictable. The exchange ended there, though something unaddressed remained between them, as persistent as the faint smell of polish in the air. As Purbright stepped back outside, he noticed a new sheet pinned to the lower corner of the board. It announced a lost bracelet, sentimental but of little value, last seen near the river path. The handwriting was careful, the language apologetic. No one stood beside it, claiming ownership or concern. The inspector read it twice, then folded his hands behind his back. The notice did not say when the bracelet was lost, nor under what circumstances. It assumed, politely, that someone would know. Assumptions again, dressed as trust. Later that morning, Mrs. Cavendish passed the notice board without stopping. She nodded to Purbright, remarking that she was late for an appointment, though she did not say where. Her composure was intact, but her pace quicker than usual. She did not look at the lost bracelet notice. This omission, small as it was, interested Purbright more than her greeting. He wondered what she would have said had she stopped. Likely something practical, perhaps an offer to ask around. Her silence suggested calculation, not indifference, which was a distinction the village often failed to make. By midday the board had acquired a second edition, a penciled note about a meeting postponed, unsigned. This drew comment. Two women discussed it in low voices, speculating about illness or disorganization. Neither mentioned the bracelet. Neither noticed Purbright listening. The inspector observed how attention moved, selecting what felt safe to address. Postponed meetings invited sympathy. Lost items invited questions. The board, for all its openness, encouraged selective engagement. Out in the village obliged with practised ease. Harriet appeared just after noon, pausing before the board as if surprised to find it there. She read each notice carefully, her expression unreadable. When she reached the bracelet, she frowned, then glanced toward the river path. Purbright watched from a distance. Harriet did not remove the notice, nor did she add anything. She stood for a moment longer, then walked away, her hands clenched at her sides. The inspector noted how her presence briefly altered the mood of those nearby, who straightened or looked elsewhere, uncertain whether acknowledgement was required. By afternoon, conversation had shifted. The notice board was mentioned in shops and kitchens, its contents paraphrased with subtle variation. The lost bracelet became linked, in some tellings, to the quiet near the river. In others, it was dismissed as trivial. No one suggested connection to Tolland House, though the thought flickered and was extinguished. Purbright understood this restraint. To connect events too soon was to risk obligation. Better to let matters remain separate, contained within their respective notices and silences. As evening approached, Purbright returned once more to the board. Nothing had changed. That too was information. The village had absorbed the additions without response, preferring to wait. He reflected that what the notice board did not say was more instructive than what it displayed. It did not announce unease, suspicion, or the quiet recalibration of trust that had begun since lunch. Those things travelled elsewhere through glances, pauses, and the careful choice of words. The board remained respectable, and while the village worked privately at understanding what it preferred not to declare yet, at least for now. Inspector Purbright encountered the refusal in the form of a note left on his hall table, delivered sometime between early morning and his return from the grocer. It was brief, polite, and written in Mrs. Cavendish's hand, unmistakable in its controlled loops and deliberate spacing. She regretted, she wrote, that she would be unable to receive him that afternoon, owing to prior commitments that could not be rearranged. She trusted he would understand. The inspector did understand, though not in the way she intended, and he read the note twice before placing it beside the bread and apples, where it looked oddly domestic for something so carefully defensive. The invitation itself had been mild enough. He had mentioned, or been in passing, the previous evening, that he might call to ask a few questions, nothing formal, merely clarifying. Mrs. Cavendish had agreed at once, even suggesting a time, which made the subsequent refusal more noticeable. People who declined abruptly usually did so clumsily. This note, by contrast, had been composed with evident care, as if the manner of refusal mattered as much as the refusal itself. That, Inspector Purbright reflected, was rarely accidental. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, then continued with his morning as planned. The village responded to routine with gratitude, and he had learned not to disrupt it unnecessarily. At the post office, Mrs. Green asked after his health and whether he found the church notice board useful. He replied that it had its virtues. She nodded, satisfied. Dick then mentioned she had seen Mrs. Cavendish earlier, hurrying, which was unlike her. Inspector Purbright said nothing, allowing the observation to stand without comment. Mrs. Green added that perhaps it was nothing, though her tone suggested she hoped it was something explainable later. Outside, the river path lay quiet under a thin cover of cloud. The lost bracelet notice had already inspired speculation. A man walking his dog remarked that such things turned up eventually, usually somewhere obvious. The inspector agreed, though he thought of Harriet reading the notice with tightened expression. He walked a little way along the path, noting the damp earth and the careful avoidance of puddles by those passing through. Nothing appeared disturbed. Appearances, he knew, were often diligently maintained. Near midday, that he encountered Harriet outside the baker's. She greeted him with a mixture of relief and reserve, which softened briefly when he asked how she was. She said she was well enough, then added, too quickly, that she was busy. He asked whether she might have time later for a short walk. She hesitated, then smiled apologetically, saying she had promised to help Mrs. Hale that afternoon. The excuse was plausible, yet delivered with precision, as if she had prepared it. Inspector Purbright accepted it without challenge. He had learned that refusals, like invitations, revealed more when not contested. As the day wore on, the pattern repeated. An elderly gentleman declined a chat, citing a nap. Miss Felgrove excused herself from conversation with a sudden task in the vestry. Even Mr. Linton, encountered by the Green, claimed a pressing letter to finish. Each refusal was polite, reasonable, and slightly too complete. The inspector began to see the shape of it. The village was closing ranks, not against him, but against uncertainty. Invitations declined too carefully were not rejections of inquiry, but attempts to delay it until agreement could be reached on what was safe to say. By late afternoon he returned home, making tea and reading the note once more. Mrs. Cavendish had chosen her words well. Prior commitments could mean almost anything. What mattered was not the reason given, but the decision to give one at all. Silence might have been simpler. Explanation invited interpretation. The inspector wondered whether she had consulted anyone before writing, or whether the decision had been hers alone. Control, he suspected, which was more comfortable exercised individually, even if shared later as consensus. As evening approached, a knock sounded at his door. It was Miss Felgrove, bearing a small parcel and an air of quiet resolve. She said she had meant to call earlier, but had not wished to intrude. He invited her in. She spoke at length about the jumble sale, the choir, and the difficulty of keeping track of things lately. Eventually she mentioned Mrs. Cavendish, remarking that she seemed tired. Inspector Purbright listened, offering only acknowledgement. When Miss Felgrove left, she looked relieved, though she had said nothing of substance. The visit itself was the substance. After she had gone, the inspector stood by the window, watching the village settle into evening. Lights appeared one by one. Somewhere, a door closed with finality. Invitations had been offered, declined, and reshaped throughout the day, each interaction adjusting the balance slightly. Nothing overt had occurred, yet the careful refusals suggested preparation, not avoidance. Whatever lay ahead would not announce itself plainly. It would arrive by courtesy, deferred until the village believed it could be managed. Inspector Purbright allowed himself a thin smile. Carefully declined invitations often preceded unguarded admissions, once patience had done its work properly. The weather arrived before the inspector did, announcing itself with a low sky and the particular dampness that encouraged people to speak of it at length. Inspector Purbright welcomed this. Weather gave permission for conversation without commitment, and he listened as villagers discussed cloud, wind, and the possibility of rain with a seriousness usually reserved for matters they preferred not to name. He walked slowly through the morning, aware that conditions shaped behavior as much as character, and that today's uncertainty suited the village's present mood rather well. At the corner shop, Mrs. Green remarked that the air felt heavy, as though something were waiting. Purbright agreed, observing that such weather often delayed rather than prevented rain. She considered this, then said she hoped it would clear by afternoon. Hope, he reflected, was frequently expressed as meteorology. Outside, the street lay quiet, shop doors opening later than usual, as if the village itself were reluctant to begin. The inspector noted how often people glanced upward, measuring the sky, before glancing at one another and saying nothing further. But he continued toward the green, where a small group had gathered to discuss the state of the path near the river. Damp ground, they said, made it treacherous. Someone mentioned the lost bracelet again, wondering if rain might wash it further downstream. Another replied that it would likely turn up where it fell. Inspector Purbright listened without contributing, considering how weather provided a convenient explanation for misplacement, delay, and even oversight. If rain intervened, responsibility shifted. Nature, after all, could not be questioned politely. By late morning, the sky darkened slightly, though no rain fell. This produced a particular tension. People adjusted plans, cancelling walks, postponing errands, yet remaining alert for change. Purbright observed Harriet crossing the green, her coat folded over her arm despite the chill. She paused to speak with someone, then moved on, her pace uneven. He wondered whether she found the weather oppressive or simply distracting. Some people found stillness more difficult to endure than disruption. Rain, at least, declared itself. Near noon he encountered Mr. Linton, who commented that such weather encouraged introspection. Purbright replied that it also encouraged assumption. Mr. Linton smiled uncertainly, then spoke of his concern for Mrs. Cavendish, who had been uncharacteristically withdrawn. He suggested the weather might be affecting her. The inspector said that was possible. They parted on agreeable terms, each satisfied they had addressed something without quite approaching it. As the day progressed, clouds thickened, and the village responded with visible relief, or expectation resolved into probability. Umbrellas appeared, doors closed more firmly, conversation grew lighter, as though the promise of rain permitted people to release some of their caution. Inspector Purbright walked toward the river path, noting how the air smelled of wet leaves before any had fallen. The path remained undisturbed, though footprints were softened by moisture. He considered how easily impressions were altered once conditions changed, and how quickly certainty eroded under pressure applied from without rather than within. Rain finally arrived in the early afternoon, light but persistent. The inspector stood beneath a tree, watching it darken the ground. Weather, he thought, was the village's preferred metaphor. It allowed events to be framed as passing conditions rather than consequences of choice, or if something unpleasant occurred, it could be attributed to circumstances beyond control. If nothing happened, that too could be explained. Rain might reveal or conceal, depending on need. He returned home briefly, making tea and listening to the steady sound against the window. The rhythm encouraged thought without urgency. He reviewed the day so far, noting how often weather had entered conversation as explanation, reassurance, or diversion. People had declined invitations, postponed discussions, and deferred decisions, all under the reasonable authority of the sky. The inspector did not dismiss this. He merely observed that weather, like courtesy, could delay reckoning, but not prevent it indefinitely. By late afternoon, the rain eased, leaving the village damp and reflective. People emerged cautiously, reassessing plans. A Miss Felgrove passed by, remarking that the air felt cleaner. Purbright agreed. She hesitated, then added that some matters felt clearer after rain. He said nothing, allowing the thought to stand. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and moved on. As evening approached, clouds broke, revealing a pale stretch of sky. The village resumed its shape, altered slightly by moisture and reconsideration. Inspector Purbright walked once more toward the green, aware that the weather had done its work. Conversations had shifted, assumptions adjusted, and patience tested. Whatever came next would not be attributed to rain, though rain would be mentioned. He smiled faintly, acknowledging the village's skill in reading the sky while avoiding the ground beneath its feet, for now at least. By the following morning the village seemed ready to speak, in which was not the same as being prepared to finish what it started. Inspector Purbright noticed this as he crossed the green, where conversations opened easily and closed just as quickly. People greeted him with unusual warmth, then offered fragments of thought, each shaped like the beginning of an explanation. He accepted them patiently, aware that explanations, when offered prematurely, were often rehearsals rather than truths. Mrs. Green was the first to attempt one. She spoke of the weather again, then of Mrs. Cavendish, lowering her voice as though weather might overhear. She suggested that the lunch had been tiring, that age and responsibility weighed heavily, and that any oddness should be forgiven. Purbright listened, nodded, and thanked her. Before he could reply, she added that, of course, she did not mean to excuse anything, and then stopped herself, cheeks colouring, and changed the subject to bread deliveries. The explanation had been offered, then withdrawn, leaving only its outline behind. Later, near the post office, Mr. Linton approached with a more structured account. He began by saying that misunderstandings were common in villages, especially when people assumed motives without sufficient cause. He suggested that Harriet's oysters had been meant kindly, perhaps as a peace offering of sorts, though he admitted he did not know what peace was being offered. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable, even as they failed to settle into conviction. Halfway through, he paused, adjusted his coat, and said that he might be mistaken. Purbright agreed that he might. Mr. Linton looked relieved, thanked him for listening, and walked away. Of explanation incomplete by mutual consent. By midday, the pattern repeated often enough to become noticeable. Miss Felgrove called at the inspector's door with a cake she did not mention again. She spoke of the choir, of strained voices and uncertain attendance, then ventured that perhaps the village had been unkind to Harriet without meaning to be. She suggested that youth sometimes appeared disruptive simply by existing. When Purbright asked what she meant, she laughed softly and said she had no idea, really. The explanation dissolved, leaving behind a sense of apology without an object. Inspector Purbright did not pursue these moments. He understood their purpose. Explanations offered too early served to test reactions. If accepted, they might be repeated. If questioned, they could be withdrawn without cost. The village was feeling for balance, adjusting its narrative in response to his presence, measuring how much clarity might be tolerated without discomfort. He allowed this process to continue, knowing that eventual certainty required space. In the afternoon, Harriet herself sought him out, finding him near the river path where the ground still held the morning's damp. She greeted him directly without the hesitations others had displayed. She said she thought she should explain. Purbright inclined his head, saying nothing. She began by speaking of her aunt, of obligation and expectation, of how certain gestures took on meanings never intended. She said the oysters had been a mistake, though not an accident. As she spoke, her voice steadied, and the explanation gained shape. Then she stopped. "That isn't quite right," she said, frowning. I don't want it to sound like that." She fell silent, looking toward the water. Purbright waited. After a moment, she said that perhaps it was better left unsaid, that explanations could do harm as easily as good. She smiled apologetically, as though withdrawing a gift. The inspector said he understood. She thanked him, though he had offered nothing, and walked away with brisk determination. As the day wore on, the withdrawn explanations accumulated. Mrs. Cavendish sent a message requesting to see him after all, then sent another cancelling, citing fatigue. Someone else mentioned the bracelet again, then suggested it was likely misplaced at home. Each attempt to clarify something retreated at the moment it risked commitment. Purbright observed this without impatience. He knew that withdrawal often indicated awareness. People withdrew, not because they lacked information, but because they recognized its weight. In the quiet of late afternoon, the inspector sat by his window, reviewing the day's fragments. None of the explanations had been false exactly. Each contained a portion of truth, arranged defensively. Together they formed a negative space around whatever the village was avoiding. He considered how often understanding emerged not from what was said, but from what could not be sustained once spoken aloud. The retractions mattered more than the offers. As evening approached, the village grew calmer. The need to explain subsided, replaced by watchfulness. Purbright sensed that the next movement would come not from talk, but from action, subtle and unannounced. Explanations would return later, refined by necessity. For now they remained suspended, withdrawn, but remembered, waiting for the moment when courtesy would no longer suffice to keep them at bay. He allowed himself a measured patience, trusting that the village would eventually tire of circling its own caution. There were limits to how long people could hold explanations in reserve before they demanded somewhere to go. Silence, too, required maintenance. It depended on shared effort, and shared effort faltered when individual comfort was threatened. Purbright suspected that comfort was already unevenly distributed. Some carried more unease than others, and imbalance invited correction. He would wait, visible but unprovocative, letting habits fray at their edges. When the next explanation appeared, it would not be offered for his benefit, but to relieve its bearer. That, he knew, would be the one worth hearing. Until then, he remained attentive to absence as much as presence, aware that what was withheld shaped events as surely as what was declared. Villages, he reflected, revealed themselves slowly, not through sudden revelations, but through the careful erosion of certainty over time. Patience was not passivity, it was an active stance requiring discipline, restraint, and the willingness to be underestimated while listening. For the moment, restraint would no longer be required by anyone involved in the unfolding matter. Mild embarrassment arrived in the village without ceremony, settling like dust where conversation paused too long. Inspector Purbright noticed it first at the grocer's, when Mrs. Green dropped her coins and laughed too brightly, apologizing as though the fault lay with the counter. Others joined in, offering reassurances that required none. The moment passed, but something had shifted. Embarrassment, he reflected, loosened certainty. It interrupted rehearsed narratives and forced people to improvise, which was often when habit slipped, and truth found room to breathe. He walked on, aware that the village was adjusting again, this time not through silence, but through small social discomforts no one could quite explain. Miss Felgrove spoke too much at the post office, then stopped abruptly, flushing as she realized she had said nothing of consequence. Mr. Linton greeted the inspector twice in as many minutes, each time as if for the first. Harriet crossed the green and turned back, having forgotten where she meant to go. None of this mattered individually. Together, it suggested strain. By late morning, a minor incident provided focus. The Mrs. Bellingham's terrier escaped its lead and dashed through the open church door during a quiet moment of preparation. The resulting confusion was brief but awkward. Apologies overlapped, laughter arrived late, and the dog was retrieved amid murmured reassurances. Inspector Purbright observed how people lingered afterward, exchanging remarks that acknowledged the disruption while hinting at others less easily addressed. Embarrassment, mild and shared, permitted proximity without commitment. It softened defenses without demanding explanation. Outside, conversation grew tentative, then freer. Someone mentioned the lost bracelet again, joking that perhaps the dog had taken it. Another replied that dogs preferred bones. The remark drew a ripple of amusement, followed by an uncomfortable pause. But the inspector noted how easily levity slid into unease. He said nothing, allowing the moment to resolve itself. It did, imperfectly, leaving behind a residue of awareness that not everything could be laughed away. Harriet approached him later, visibly unsettled by the morning's awkwardness. She remarked that the village felt strange lately, as though everyone were waiting for someone else to speak first. Purbright agreed, observing that waiting often produced its own difficulties. She smiled faintly, then admitted she had nearly told Miss Felgrove something earlier, but had stopped, unsure how it would sound. Embarrassment, he said, could be instructive. It reminded people that words had weight. Harriet considered this, then said she wished more people remembered it before speaking. But the inspector refrained from pointing out that remembering it after could be equally useful. In the afternoon, Mrs. Cavendish encountered the inspector outside the church, an unplanned meeting that produced visible discomfort. She greeted him warmly, then hesitated, as though uncertain whether to proceed or retreat. She commented on the terrier incident, calling it unfortunate but amusing. Purbright replied that such moments revealed character. She laughed, then stopped, realizing she did not know whether he was agreeing. Colour rose in her cheeks. She said she hoped he had not misunderstood her earlier note. He said he had understood it perfectly. The embarrassment lingered, sharpening her expression. She said she might call on him soon, then excused herself, leaving the promise deliberately vague. As the day progressed, the embarrassment continued its quiet work. Mr. Linton corrected himself mid-sentence during a conversation about village affairs, then laughed self-consciously. Miss Felgrove apologized twice for the same remark. Even Mrs. Green admitted she had been mistaken about a delivery. These admissions were small, but they mattered. Each one loosened the grip of assumption, replacing certainty with provisional understanding. Inspector Purbright observed how quickly people adjusted, relieved to find that imperfection did not immediately invite judgment. By evening, the village seemed lighter, though no clearer. Embarrassment had not resolved anything, but it had altered the terrain. People were less guarded, more aware of how they appeared, and therefore more attentive. The inspector walked home as lights came on, considering how often progress arrived sideways. Direct confrontation stiffened resistance. Mild embarrassment, shared and unthreatening, created space. It allowed people to reconsider without feeling accused. At his window, Purbright reviewed the day. Nothing decisive had occurred, no explanation had been offered. Yet the village felt closer to readiness. Embarrassment had unsettled rehearsed positions, leaving gaps where understanding might later settle. He suspected that someone, perhaps more than one, was now reconsidering what could be said without undue consequence. When they spoke next, it would not be to impress or defend, but to relieve a pressure they could no longer ignore. He poured himself a drink and waited, content to let discomfort continue its work. Embarrassment, after all, was not an enemy of truth. It was often its advance notice, arriving first to announce that something long maintained was becoming difficult to sustain. Inspector Purbright first noticed the habit because it was so easy to overlook. It belonged to Mrs. Hale, who walked the river path each morning at the same hour, stopping at the same bend to look into the water. The village regarded this as a harmless eccentricity, something to be tolerated rather than examined. People spoke of it fondly, as though repetition itself rendered behavior innocent. The inspector, however, had learned that habits were often repositories of meaning, mistaken for comfort because they were familiar. That morning he followed at a distance, careful not to intrude. Mrs. Hale moved steadily, her pace unhurried, her attention fixed ahead. When she reached the bend, she paused as usual, leaning slightly on the railing. She did not look distressed. She did not look contemplative. She looked purposeful, as though confirming something already known. After a moment, she straightened and continued on, the ritual complete. Purbright noted the precision of it. Habits rarely persisted so exactly without reason. Later, the habit was mentioned casually at the grocer's. Mrs. Green remarked that Mrs. Hale was devoted to her walks, that it was admirable at her age. Someone else added that routine kept one grounded. Inspector Purbright agreed, though he observed that routine could also conceal effort. No one pursued the thought. The village preferred habits explained by temperament rather than necessity. It spared everyone the discomfort of curiosity. By midday, the habit had acquired another interpretation. When Miss Felgrove suggested that Mrs. Hale walked to manage her nerves, that the river calmed her. Mr. Linton nodded, adding that grief often sought repetition. The inspector listened, recognizing how quickly speculation dressed itself as empathy. Each explanation reassured the speaker more than the subject. No one asked Mrs. Hale. Habit, once agreed upon, removed the need for inquiry. In the afternoon, Harriet mentioned the walk in passing, her tone sharper. She said it was odd that Mrs. Hale always stopped at the same place. When Purbright asked why she found it odd, Harriet shrugged, saying she did not know, only that she noticed things more lately. The inspector said that noticing was useful. Harriet smiled briefly, then looked away, as though uncertain whether she wished to be encouraged. As evening approached, Purbright encountered Mrs. Hale herself, resting on a bench near the green. She greeted him readily, remarking that she had seen him by the river earlier. He admitted as much and asked about her walks. She laughed softly, saying people always noticed the stopping more than the walking. He asked what she looked for. She hesitated, then said she checked the water level. This explanation sounded practical, almost dull. Purbright asked why. She replied that the river rose unexpectedly sometimes. He nodded, allowing the answer to settle. After a pause, she added that she had once lost something there, long ago. Her voice remained even. The inspector did not ask what. She continued, saying that habits formed from loss were difficult to abandon, even when the loss could not be repaired. He said that was often the case. She looked at him closely. I then smiled, as though reassured by his lack of surprise. The next day, the habit became a topic of mild embarrassment. Someone joked about setting a clock by Mrs. Hale's walks. Laughter followed, then faltered. The inspector observed how humour faltered when it brushed against something unexamined. Mrs. Hale was not present to hear it, which eased conscience without resolving curiosity. Habit continued, misunderstood, yet intact. By midweek, the lost bracelet notice had faded, curling at the edges. Someone remarked that perhaps Mrs. Hale had been looking for it all along. Another dismissed the idea, saying she would have said so. Purbright considered this. People often assumed that if something mattered, it would be announced. They underestimated the power of quiet persistence. Habits, unlike declarations, did not invite interference. That afternoon, rain returned briefly, swelling the river. Mrs. Hale altered her walk slightly, stopping longer at the bend. The inspector watched from the path, noting how her attention sharpened. When she turned away, she looked relieved. Later, she told Mrs. Green that the water had risen, but not dangerously. This information circulated, reassuring those who had not known they were concerned. Only gradually did understanding begin to shift. Someone recalled that the river had flooded years ago, damaging property and worse. Another remembered that Mrs. Hale had been present then. These recollections emerged tentatively, adjusted for politeness. The habit, once charming, acquired weight. It was no longer merely eccentric, it was vigilance. Inspector Purbright reflected that everyone had misunderstood the habit because they had preferred it harmless. They had dressed it in sentiment and sympathy, avoiding the implication that someone might still be watching for danger they themselves chose to forget. Mrs. Hale's walks were not about comfort or grief alone. They were about responsibility assumed quietly and maintained without recognition. As the week drew on, the village adjusted its understanding without comment. No one apologized. No one asked further questions. Habits, once reinterpreted, were allowed to continue under their new meaning. The inspector found this satisfactory. Understanding did not always require acknowledgement. Sometimes it required only that behavior be seen accurately at last, without the softening veil of assumption that made it easier to ignore what patients had been guarding all along, for years, without complaint or explanation, simply waiting for others to notice what had always been there, steady and unremarked until circumstances made it impossible to misunderstand any longer. By the time reason began to clear its throat, the village had already settled into a listening posture. Inspector Purbright sensed it in the way conversation slowed when he passed, not stopping, merely stretching, as though awaiting a cue that had not yet been given. People were ready now, not for accusation, but for coherence. They wanted events to make sense without demanding that anyone stand apart from the rest. It began, appropriately, with Mr. Linton, who requested a word and then took several minutes to decide which one. Then they walked together along the green, speaking first of nothing at all. Eventually, Mr. Linton said that certain assumptions had been allowed to stand too long, and that he felt uneasy about it. Purbright said unease was often the first honest response. Encouraged, Mr. Linton spoke of the lunch, of Harriet's deliberate interruption, and of Mrs. Cavendish's insistence on control. He admitted that he had assumed selfishness where there might have been caution. Saying this aloud seemed to cost him effort. He stopped, waiting for correction. The inspector offered none. Word travelled quickly, not of what was said, but of the fact that something had been said at all. Miss Felgrove followed, finding Purbright near the church and remarking that she had been thinking. She said she had dismissed Harriet too easily, to mistaking discomfort for impropriety. She wondered whether politeness had been used to smooth over something sharper. Purbright replied that politeness often did. Miss Felgrove nodded, relieved to find her thought received without judgment. Reason, having cleared its throat, was beginning to speak softly. Mrs. Cavendish arrived later, not seeking the inspector, but encountering him as though by chance. She commented on the weather, then paused. The pause mattered. She said that she had been wrong to refuse him so carefully, that in doing so she had created the impression of concealment. She insisted there had been none, then faltered, realizing that insistence weakened her claim. Purbright listened, attentive but unresponsive. Finally, she said that she had been afraid of losing authority, not because she was guilty, but because she was tired. The admission sat between them, unadorned. She straightened, thanked him for his discretion, and moved on, having said more than she intended and less than she knew. By afternoon, reason had found its rhythm. Harriet spoke openly with Mrs. Green, acknowledging that the oysters had been meant as provocation, but not cruelty. She said she had wanted honesty, not spectacle. Mrs. Green admitted she had preferred comfort. They parted without resolution, but with understanding. Nearby, Mrs. Hale walked her usual path, unnoticed now, her habit newly respected. The village adjusted its gaze, recognizing vigilance where it had once seen eccentricity. Inspector Purbright observed these exchanges without directing them. He understood that reason did not arrive as a declaration, but as a series of recognitions, each one small, cumulative, and privately owned. No single conversation resolved the matter. Instead, clarity emerged through alignment as assumptions were corrected and motivations reweighed. Toward evening, the lost bracelet was found, lodged beneath a stone near the river bend. Mrs. Hale retrieved it calmly and returned it to the notice board, adding a brief note of thanks. No one asked why she had known where to look. The village accepted the recovery as natural, even inevitable. Reason did not insist on explanation when understanding had already settled. As dusk approached, Inspector Purbright stood by the green, listening to the village resume its ordinary sounds. Conversations flowed more easily now, unburdened by withheld explanation. The sound of reason clearing its throat faded, replaced by speech that no longer needed rehearsal. Till nothing dramatic had occurred, no confrontation had been required, yet something essential had shifted. The village had learned briefly to listen past its own courtesy, and in doing so had restored a balance that had been quietly disturbed. Purbright allowed himself a moment of satisfaction tempered by restraint. Reason, he knew, required maintenance. It cleared its throat often, and was just as often ignored. For now, however, it had been heard, and that was enough. He turned toward home, leaving the village to its renewed confidence, aware that understanding achieved without force tended to endure longer than truth imposed too loudly, too quickly, or without regard for the fragile arrangements by which people chose to live together. He had seen such moments before, where a community corrected itself without spectacle, to preferring adjustment to rupture. This tendency did not make villages innocent, merely survivable. Here, people would remember the week as unsettled but manageable. They would not speak of lessons, only of relief. Purbright accepted this, knowing that understanding seldom announced itself as wisdom. It appeared instead as altered behavior, quieter confidence, and the absence of certain questions once thought necessary. He reached his door, paused, and listened once more to the village behind him. The sound of voices carried easily now, no longer strained by avoidance. He stepped inside, content to let the matter rest, trusting that what had been understood would endure, not because it was perfect, but because it had been arrived at together, through patience, restraint, and the shared willingness to allow reason its moment, however brief, before habit reclaimed the day, and life resumed its ordinary, complicated, and quietly negotiated course. There would be other moments, he knew, when reason would clear its throat again, perhaps less politely. For now, the village required no further intervention. He removed his coat, set it aside, and allowed the evening to settle, confident that understanding earned, through listening, lingered longer than certainty forced too soon, and that this truth, quietly held, would serve them all better than any conclusion imposed from without, however tidy. The village did not mark the ending, which was how Inspector Purbright knew it had arrived. No one gathered, no announcement followed. The day began as others had, with doors opening, errands resumed, and conversation returning to acceptable subjects. A relief expressed itself indirectly as efficiency. People completed tasks with renewed confidence, as though tidiness might confirm that nothing untoward remained unsettled. Purbright walked through it all with measured ease, aware that resolution here was never declared, only absorbed. Mrs. Cavendish passed him near the green and paused, saying she hoped he was well. Her tone was calm, unguarded, and free of the careful firmness that had once characterized her speech. She remarked that the village had been restless lately, then added that such phases passed. Purbright agreed. She did not mention oysters, invitations, or explanations withdrawn, nor did she need to. The matter had moved beyond articulation. She smiled, genuinely this time, and continued on her way lighter in step than before. At the post office, our Mrs. Green chatted amiably with a customer about bread and weather. She glanced at the inspector and nodded, including him without comment. The lost bracelet was no longer discussed. Its return had settled the last lingering discomfort, not because it explained anything, but because it closed a small circle. Objects once restored reassured people that order remained possible. Purbright observed this with quiet approval. Villages preferred tangible conclusions, even when the true resolution lay elsewhere. Harriet appeared later, carrying a parcel she did not hurry with. She greeted the inspector directly, thanking him for his patience. He said nothing more than was necessary. She remarked that she would be leaving soon for a time, though she did not explain why. He wished her well. She smiled, too relieved that he did not ask for justification. Departures, like endings, did not require defense if properly timed. Mrs. Hale passed along the river path, completing her walk without pause. The habit had eased now that it was understood, though no one spoke of it. Understanding had rendered it unnecessary. Purbright watched her for a moment, then turned away, satisfied that vigilance had become shared, if unspoken. The river flowed within its bounds, neither threatening nor forgotten. As afternoon faded, the village settled fully into routine. Conversations no longer circled. Embarrassment had receded. Assumptions corrected themselves quietly, without acknowledgement. Inspector Purbright recognized this state well. It was the moment when intervention ceased to be useful. Anything further would risk disturbance rather than clarity. Yet he walked home, conscious that his presence would soon feel redundant again, which was as it should be. Inside his cottage, he removed his coat and placed it neatly aside. The silence was companionable. He reflected briefly on the week, not as a case, but as a pattern. No single act had demanded correction. No crime in the usual sense had occurred. What had required attention was a convergence of habits, assumptions and courtesy stretched too thin. The village had corrected itself by degrees, guided not by exposure but by recognition. Such endings rarely earned applause. As evening fell, a few lights appeared across the green. Someone laughed. Somewhere else, a door closed. Life resumed its steady negotiation. Inspector Purbright poured himself a drink and sat by the window, listening. There was no need to record conclusions, and they existed now in altered behavior, in glances no longer averted, in conversations that no longer stalled at familiar thresholds. He understood that the village would not remember his role distinctly. They would recall only that things had felt unsettled, then righted themselves. That suited him. Satisfaction here came not from credit, but from continuity restored without force. The inspector remained a presence, then faded back into the background, his work complete precisely because it left no spectacle behind. Later, as night deepened, he extinguished the lamp and prepared for rest. The village lay quiet, not with the tension of avoidance, but with the ease of familiarity regained. Whatever lessons had been learned would not be spoken aloud. They would persist as caution, as restraint, as the faint memory of discomfort that encouraged better listening next time. Inspector Purbright accepted this outcome without regret. Endings without applause were the most reliable kind. They left room for ordinary life to continue, unencumbered by ceremony or explanation. He closed his eyes, content that the village would wake unchanged, yet subtly improved, its balance restored through patience rather than pressure. In such places that was resolution enough.